beautifuls. You're listening to Bliss and Grit. I'm Vanessa Scotto, and I'll be joined soon by my dear friend and co-host, Brooke Thomas. On the show, we're talking about being on the embodied spiritual path. And what does that actually mean? What is a real evolution of our lives? How do we ultimately embrace everything? All the beauty and crazy, the joys and the messes, the bliss and the grit that is a human life. We'll be attempting to sort that out for ourselves here on the show. We're so glad you're listening in. In today's episode, we're talking about how to deal with our emotions in a healthy way. There's a skill to relating with emotions. We've spoken a lot in the last few episodes about how you should stop, drop, and feel. But many of us were never taught how to meet our emotional experience in any kind of a healthy manner. We're prone to venting or repressing, to taking them out on others, or to taking them out on ourselves. If emotions threaten to overwhelm us or to create disturbance in our lives, it becomes really hard to make space for them to exist. That's why in this episode, we're beginning to explore the life-changing skill of how to navigate your inner world of feelings. If you've been enjoying the show, you know we'd love it if you left a review on iTunes or on our Facebook page, which is Bliss and Grit. You can also head over to blissandgrit.com and subscribe to hear any updates on events we'll be having in the future. If you're new to the podcast, one last note before we head into the talk is that Brooke and I tend to curse sometimes. So if there are kids around, you may want to pop in some headphones. Okay, everyone. Here we go. Hello. Just so y'all know right off the bat, it's going to be a shorter episode today. We're having some scheduling problems as I'm going on a trip. So, and it's an important topic. So
maybe we'll do a part two. That's okay.
Sometimes we do that. That happens. Okay. So we've been talking a lot about feelings.
Really feeling your feelings.
And we've been talking a lot about feelings, heartbreak, grief, and despair. Last week, we were talking about why you have to go in, how you have to stop, drop, and feel. And it's been on my mind to talk about feelings because, well, so in Chinese medicine, there's this concept. They call it emotional hygiene. And it's like a whole thought process, like a whole step by step almost of like, how do you meet emotions? It seems like kind of silly that no one ever taught us how to deal with our own emotions.
It's amazing, really.
You know, it's like amazing. We never learned how to be human. There's two things that I think if we could, well, three. I'm about to solve the world's problems. Get ready.
Sweet.
If we could teach everyone these three things, meditation, Dalai Lama thinks that's enough, but I don't think that's enough. Meditation, communication, because I don't know how we have never learned how to communicate. That is one of the biggest sources of distress I see. And how to meet our emotions. We would have a much, much, much friendlier world. So I think that it would be useful for us to start to talk about how to meet our emotions, since we've been talking so much about like the benefits of going in and down. What say you?
Boy, howdy. Yeah. Let's do it. Let's solve the world's problems. I'm titling this episode, Vanessa Thinks the Dalai Lama is Wrong, by the way. Just a little, I'm just kidding.
No, I thought you were going to say Vanessa solves the world's problems.
That would also be good.
That. And then it's like
the one where Vanessa solves the world's problems. Yeah.
Well, so of course, let's talk about emotions. Let's talk about what you learned about emotions and I learned about emotions early on. Here's what I learned about emotions early on in my life. God bless you, my family. I'm sorry I use you for so much material, but there it is. Here's what I learned about emotions. There's angry and laughy, and the rest, stuff it.
Great. Also a good t-shirt. Okay, I'm going to stop designing t-shirts in my head.
You're not on board with that. Stuff it. Okay. So
yeah.
What did you learn about emotions?
I learned the way I know I'm doing a good job as a parent is if you're happy. Do not feel anything that is not happy. Make it go away.
Yeah. Yeah. So you express the emotional climate, which is happiness is the valued emotion. Mm-hmm. And then you also expressed the underlying message that you got that kind of likely kept that pattern running. Is that right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And because it was, like, let's say basic stuff that happens when you're growing up. Fail a really important test I was stressed out about. And I feel anxious and grief and whatever. And let's say I bring the test home to my parents. I'm in 9th grade and the tears start to come. Oh my God, that's immediately like, no, don't be sad. No. It's fine. It's good. Just go study, go fix it. Right. But God forbid, don't feel it, And I have to catch it with my son frequently, who's a big feeler like his mama, and just be like, it's okay. It's okay to feel angry. It's okay to feel sad, but it's not a pass to fling it.
Right.
So maybe that's one entry point to get into is that when we're talking about feeling our feelings, we're not talking about it's okay to behave however and to fling your things at other people.
Well, so I have a lot I want to say, so excuse me, but I think when you talk about flinging your emotions, you can look at, I guess you have to start out with, how do we deal with emotions? What are our common ways that we interact with emotions? And I'm going to use some kind of generalized terms. But one way that we deal with emotions that is in the unhealthy category is we stuff them. We repress them. We suppress them. You could use any of that language. We really put it in the tissues. Osho had this saying, it's like, the body cries the tears, the eyes refuse to shed.
It's a good one.
And I always got that as like so true. So we stuff it down, and we all can relate to doing that with an emotion. The second way that we can handle it that's unhealthy is we discharge it. And that's what you were saying, fling it into the room. It's like we spew the emotion out into the room. That's very common with anger. It's very common with anxiety and panic. Mm-hmm. Those are two of the more commonly discharged emotions. So you could do it with anything, grief and sadness and whatever else you want. So it's almost like if we look at it from a simplistic view, we have these two ways that we tend to meet emotions as a culture. We either go inward, so we stuff the emotions in, or we go outward and we put the emotions, we take things out on people. Mm-hmm. It makes sense so far, right?
Or even just generally, just for self-regulation, even if it doesn't harm another person, we spew out.
You could? Like, in what way would you mean?
Like some ideas about go in your room and scream into your pillow. Or even like I have a friend who was doing somatic experiencing, which is a really great method. And the practitioner said to her, do you notice how frequently you do regulating breaths? Like how frequently she would discharge by, and so you think that's a good thing, right? Like, yeah, I've figured out a way how to regulate, but it's still it's an around. It's not a through. So she was helping her to be able to tolerate more sensation in a way that felt like she had room for it so that she didn't have to discharge. So even that can be a way of not going through, but going around.
Mm-hmm. A much more subtle one. You almost have to get a little advanced, I think, to get to that.
For sure.
That one where you're using breathing or something. They used to have these groups in the 70s where everyone would like scream in pillows and like punch things.
And they, of course, were next door to the early Rolfing trainings. And so everyone linked them in their mind. But that's a gripe for another day.
And it like, it's catharsis, right? So we have this idea that catharsis, this discharge will really release the emotions, which you can get where we would have that idea. It's like, well, it's stored up and I just let it out.
Right.
And
I'm feeling it.
It would be gone. And to a certain extent, I don't want to say that's wrong. For example, some really healthy venting. I've noticed when I used to be, when I was training in school to be a therapist, and I would have this, I was in a supervisory group. And sometimes I had really difficult clients, like really difficult. And you would talk about them in the supervisory group because it was, like a low fee clinic. So you got like a real mix. And I noticed like, geez, you know what? When I share about this, my emotions start to relax, right? And I realized like, of course, I'm storing this energy from holding that space. And then as I put that energy out into the group can kind of digest a little bit of it. And this is what I think a tribe does, actually. I think it's what a family does. We're actually ecosystems. That's why I've told you there's that, there are those research studies that show that if you were to have elevated cortisol levels, your kids' levels would go up as yours would go down. We are made to regulate each other. So there's a little bit, not to knock discharging, where if you've never been angry in your life and you have a therapist who tells you to go scream in a car where no one can hear, it will move something and it could open up some throat energy and it could feel great. The same thing can be said, like there's always a great time and place to kind of vent in a way that's healthy and nourishing and sharing. So, just to put that caveat out there. But what we're really talking about is habitual programming that people go to. It's almost like how we walk is patterned. Well, how we deal with emotions is patterned. And we have these kind of go-to movements that get overused. And that sort of, I guess, even say something about the world and how you see it, right? Because if I'm someone who thinks like just screaming every time I have a feeling or like spewing my panic into the room is the thing to do, what must I believe about your role? Right? I must believe that people are there. They have to be there for me. Unconditional love would mean you put up with my emotions, right? How we deal must imply a lot. I was a turn-in person and I also hated myself. No wonder, right? Like I was too bad. I couldn't bother anyone with my emotions. It said something about kind of my view on the world. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay, so we have these two general ways. And then the nuanced way of like even how we regulate to just get around it. Because we also have distraction, which is a favored technique of mine. And
Me too. Busy. I'm so busy with work projects.
Oh, yeah. Mine's not
funny
work.
hot TV.
Yes. I'm so busy watching 30 Rock. I can't feel anything.
I need to watch every episode all the way through for a 7th time.
Which I do recommend. Sometimes I feel like emotions can get exhausting when they're so big. So I am a believer in timeouts. But I guess let's talk about the alternative. So if I'm not going to feel my emotion, meaning like yell at the top of my lungs because I'm angry, or feel my emotions in the way where I talk ad nauseum about every single problem I have, then what do I do?
Yeah, I think this is what gets into the cultural problem that my whole work life is based around, which is that we are a culture that lives from the egoic thinking mind. And so we think that's all there is. And so we think that our bodies and our somatic sensations are just things that help us to do what our thinking mind, the controller, is telling us to do. Feeling your emotions in order to metabolize them is a somatic thing. It's a felt sense thing. It's about making the space to actually feel what you're feeling. And so as I've been on this path, what I would say is that I keep removing thinking mind barriers. And what I notice is I feel more. I feel things I didn't feel in the past. I feel things in the room in the moment that I wouldn't have noticed before. And sometimes that's really quite unpleasant. And what that meant for me is that I had to find a way to meet these things. I had to find a way to go in and through instead of just a new way of going, I don't like that. That's too much, you know? And so it's what is the feeling of anxiety? Let's say some circumstance comes up or it's just raw and it's just there. It's literally sitting down, getting really quiet, getting really soft in your body and exploring it with your awareness. And that sounds to a culture that thinks that we are doing everything from our thinking minds. That sounds crazy. Why would that help anything? What I'm here to say is it helps everything because you don't have to think your way through it or talk your way through it or reason your way through it. You can't go through it via the thinking mind. It's a felt sense experience. And actually just that, just putting your awareness on, wow, I really feel this kind of roiling, anxious energy in my solar plexus changes things.
Sometimes people will say that emotions are energy. And I like that analogy, or maybe it's a truth, because we also talk a lot about the nervous system when we talk about like how we meet and engage with emotions. So I like to think of the nervous system as electric, like the body electric, and emotions are energy, and they have this little charge to them. And there's something about squishing them down or distorting them, like screaming them out without actually recognizing them and meeting them where they're at and at the base, that just allows that energy to keep circulating or building or, compounding itself.
Or just becomes like a habit feedback loop even in the nervous system.
Yeah, it for certain becomes a habit feedback loop. Or like, let's say one of the common things that happens with emotional stuff is if I can't feel it, let's say I have it all stored in my stomach. Well, then I can't breathe, because if I breathe, I'm going to move my stomach and that energy is going to get disturbed. It's going to open. It's going to start to move because energy always moves and releases. Well, then I have to tighten my diaphragm. So now I can't breathe. So now I can't even have life, right? I can't even engage.
Yeah.
So now nothing can move, right? Because you can't breathe. Because if you were, you'd feel that energy ball that's just sitting in your stomach, right? So there's all these different distortions. So I think the way that we begin, it is a little bit about capacity, like how can we learn to meet this energy and make space for it? And that's, I guess this is how I'm going to divide it. There's a psychological piece to that. Like, am I safe to experience emotions? Was that judged? Is that shameful? Is that weak? Right? So there's this psychological piece we bring to the meeting of it that can add its own energy, right? Because if now I have shame for an emotion, that's another emotion I'm piling on. Or conversely, we can look at the physiology of it, right? So that your nervous system really has this window of tolerance, and it can tolerate just about a certain amount of energy before it kicks into your unconscious defense mechanisms. And when it does, it will either discharge or repress. It'll go into that habitual movement. So as we're beginning to shift the way that we navigate our emotions, it's like we're building our window of tolerance physically and psychologically for experiencing them, right? For just feeling it. So when you begin to do, I think what you were saying, Brooke, which is the way I work with clients, is the way I work with myself, it's meditative, but there's also psychological traditions that use it, like focusing or like John Wellwood's work. Hakomi. Yeah. So it's like, okay, let's give an example. So let's say there was a couple of weeks ago where Mario was supposed to come here, and I hadn't seen him in weeks, and I was all by myself, and he had to go on a work trip instead. And my I'm alone pain body got triggered. Dun, dun, dun. And then the question you would have is like, okay, well, where is that emotion happening? Where's that felt sense happening in my body? That's what you would ask yourself. And then you would feel it like, it's like a pit in my stomach. It's like a deep pit in my stomach. And you may say it's sadness, but where's the sadness? Okay, the sadness is in my chest, right? So we're starting to look at like where we can identify it in our soma, because there's a reason why they use the word feelings is you feel them. So they're in your soma. So when you're starting to work with emotions, they're not a cognitive concept. If you don't feel them in your body, something's awry, you're telling a narrative and you want to tune in deeper. So once you feel them in your body and you can touch them with awareness, as you had said earlier, Brooke, then we're actually doing a couple of things. One, we're just making space for them. And since emotions are energy, they have this funny way of moving, of like releasing, of being alive, like an animal. It's like, they just, flow. They have a different movement to them. So that's one thing that happens. The other thing that happens is you build physiological tolerance, right? Like you start to almost like turning on a faucet, like you let some drip in and now all of a sudden your body starts to learn like, okay, I can sit with this amount of emotion, and you actually build your nervous system capacity to meet that experience. But the last thing I think you also do, and this is what I think can be really important for us, is you start to build confidence that these emotions are not you, and they're not going to take you down.
Yeah.
And they're not going to like make you lose your ever loving mind or tear you into pieces. That in fact, the Buddhist analogy where you are the sun and the emotions are like clouds passing by, or the thoughts are like clouds passing by, is in fact true.
Storms can't hurt the sky. Love that
Storms can't hurt the sky, because there you are, and I'm touching into that pit in my stomach of aloneness, but I'm aware I'm touching into that pit of aloneness. Well, then I can't be the aloneness and I can't be the feeling because I'm aware. So now I'm observing it. So then what is it? And now I can make space for it. And oh gosh, when I make space for it, it changes and it turns maybe into a sweetness of love, or maybe it just melts and I feel stillness, and all of these different things happen. And then I start to get this confidence, like I am not my emotion. My emotions don't have to rule my life. They're just a bubbling up of my humanity. They're a spontaneous arising. And if I stop with the habitual pattern of either discharging or holding them in, my emotions are actually a source of wisdom. They're messengers and they're alive, right? That's the fucked up part, Brooke, about some of the messaging we got as children, and maybe many of you listening got, is that when it's not safe to feel emotions in your household, like the whole range of emotions, or when your emotion gets judged, like, I'm so sad. And they're like, don't be sad. You shouldn't be sad over that. You shouldn't even care what that person thinks. Okay. So let's say your emotion gets judged. Emotions spontaneously arise, right? Like,
yeah, it's not
you don't choose
coming from a controller mind.
No, I never sat down and was like, I feel like being really sad right now. So what they are then is spontaneous. Well, if they're spontaneous, they're part of your spontaneous nature. That means they are part of your self-so movement. They're implicit to your aliveness. So as soon as you get the message that you should not feel what you are feeling because it's dangerous, it's wrong, it's bad, it's unsafe, whatever, you start to inhibit your aliveness.
Yeah. And you're putting a big old shellac over what's true for you and how to even have an experience of your own truth. One of the things, like as I'm listening to you talk, that I think is important to put a little closer attention on is you're talking about a process of adaptation. And it's another thing that I think we have very little tolerance for in our culture, is that there's this beautiful process of slow adaptation over time. So I've used this analogy before, but if I were going to train for a marathon, if I wanted to run a marathon, I wouldn't just put on my sneakers and go run 26 miles right now. I would be badly injured, and I certainly wouldn't finish the 26 miles. I would do a whole bunch of things. For starters, I would get a teacher. I'm not a runner. I would figure out, like, what do I feel for me is going to be the best teacher, I would maybe find a group. I would maybe find a friend who wants to do it with me. You know, like I would reach out for support. And then I would begin the very slow, in my case, because of how I understand the human body. If I want to run a marathon, I would spend 5 years adapting to that, me personally, because I understand how slowly the body adapts to a task that big without being injured. So in the spiritual sense, a perfect example of somebody who had zero adaptation, went from 0 to 60, is our teacher, Karen Trace. Not because she asked for it, but because she had a spontaneous and sudden awakening. She went from a person who had persistent PTSD and a really challenging life to wide fucking awake to the true nature of reality. It was profoundly traumatic to her. I'm not trying to put words in her mouth. These are words you can hear out of her mouth in various interviews and things here and there. And there are stories throughout history about people who became suddenly awake and then they didn't even know where to put the food to keep themselves alive because they were so blown wide open. It's the same as like rupturing an Achilles when you attempt to run a marathon that you haven't properly trained for. There's a rupture. So there's a real beauty in things happening slowly. It's such a grace from God. Or like even my body, I had a birth injury and I grew up with chronic pain and dysfunction. I'm 42 and my body is way more capable now than it was as a kid and as an adolescent. That was I've spent the last 20 years rehabilitating my body. I will continue to. It's a great pleasure. You know, at year 10, I still couldn't do a forward fold and like get my hands anywhere near the floor. At 10 years into rehabbing my body, now here at year 20, I can very easily do that. That's a great pleasure. It had to happen slowly because I had had an injury, you know, to my nervous system when I was born. So adaptation, very important. Slowness is a beautiful thing. So what we're asking is just to have this compassionate space of like little more curious to start building out tolerance. It's not about make it go away. The make it go away is the flip side of that coin, right? Like, I don't like this, make it go away.
I think in the beginning too, you know, even though with somatic experiencing, they had offered to your friend, like, okay, you're breathing to regulate rather than going in. If you're not in relationship with a provider like that, someone who could really help you get to that nuance, in the beginning, breath is just the best friend that you can have, right? It's like you bring your awareness into this spot in your body, and we can give you resources, John Wellwood, focusing, different things to play with. We're always at your disposal for questions, but you go into this spot in your body and you breathe. You hold your awareness while breathing, because breathing brings you into the present and because it begins to move the energy. So it starts to make space for something to evolve. You're not trying to come to a place of Zen. You're not trying to get happy. You're not trying to change it. So you're really having this touch, this awareness, but you're accepting, right? So it's like becoming aware, accepting it there, like acknowledging it, accepting it, like, okay, there's anger. It's living in my jaw. I'm acknowledging it. I'm accepting it. And I'm just touching it as if I had the utmost of curiosity, as if anger was not a bad thing. Imagine that, as if it was just part of a human experience that was unfolding, like a mystery to wonder about. And we just touch it and then we make space for it, where it's like we just let it be. We don't try to keep it under control. We don't try to resist it. We just give it space to do what it does. And then let's just see what happens. And this is how you start to build the ability to meet it without taking it out on people. And without this, we don't have time to, I think, get to, but the big risk I find when people start to feel their emotions, I've seen people who go from frozen to like saying whatever the fuck is on their mind and like giving everybody a piece of their emotion, you know, I'm going to tell my truth. And and that's off the mark too. That's just the pendulum swinging in the other direction, because that's not about you meeting it. You're just discharging the energy out into the world. And then it creates these chaotic patterns because it's too much for anyone else to digest. You know, and then it becomes unworkable. And then you're like, why are people turning away from me? I knew that emotions were problematic. And
Because you're just acting out, you're creating circumstances for your pain body to get confirmed, which is when I experience emotions, people will turn away from me. I will be too much for people.
I will be too much.
So it's all the same. Whether you're repressing or you're spewing, you're just giving yourself evidence that pain body is right.
This is how I know we need a second episode on this, because, there's this thing that I learned when I was in Hakomi therapy as a patient. And it's going to sound simple to some of you, but it was a light bulb to me, which is having a feeling and acting on a feeling were two distinctly different things.
Yeah, it's so important.
I didn't know it. So I was so afraid to have my feelings because I didn't want to be a raging lunatic like my father and run around the house chasing kids around from like a point of anger, right? So just stuff them down, because in my wiring got this idea that if you have an emotion, you have to kind of act on it in some way that can become unsafe, or they're very distinct things. So what we're really talking about is not acting on emotion. We're talking about feeling them. We haven't even touched upon how you engage with someone really from the place of emotion. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So that's maybe a whole different thing. So, when you start to like absorb this conversation of like, how do I meet my emotions in a more healthy way? Remember, step one is how you can develop friendliness with your own self, with your own arising self. And then step two are things like, how do I communicate to people?
Yeah.
How do I ask for what I need? How do I state when something hurt me? It's a completely different category, how to relate to others around your emotions. Right now, what we're just talking about is that in order to experience our aliveness and our inhibited, spontaneous self, we have to go in and through to not be afraid of ourselves.
Yeah. To
not feel our emotions is to be afraid of ourselves.
And just as we wrap up, I want to say that, like, for me, I definitely could not have done this on my own. I continue to not be able to do this on my own. So I had a period, when I really dropped into the path, what emerged for me was really raw anxiety in my solar plexus. I needed you. I still need you. I needed Kieran. I needed to be able to get on the phone with her and say, I can't take this anymore. I feel like I want to die. Like, these are big feelings. To try and metabolize them and feel them and sit with them instead of bypassing them when you've spent your whole life bypassing them. This is the warrior shit right here. So it's very helpful to have people, so I'm not saying sit down in your room, get quiet and feel how you kind of want to die. Feel how that's in your stomach. Bling! Now it's fixed. That's not how it's going to go, and we're building capacity slowly, but doing that with support. So I really encourage people to not feel like they should be able to
do it alone.
Right.
I agree. I can do it alone now a little, but I didn't get there alone by any means. I had a ton of support.
Yeah.
And even for the biggies, I can't do it alone still. And so what we're saying is, please do get support if you want to build these muscles. But also what we're saying is, if you're already in a relationship with a therapist or a coach or some other form of support you have, you may want to add a somatic component. Mm-hmm. You may want to add a 10 points practice from Reggie Ray. You may want to add Rolfing. You may want to add something where you can start to go in and through, because not all talk therapy really will touch upon this.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for listening to today's show. The show notes, including any resources we mentioned, live at blissandgrit.com. Just go over to the website and then scroll down, and you'll see each episode's separate post, and the resources are put right in there. You can also come chat with us on social media. Instagram and Facebook are where we're most readily available, and we're Bliss and Grit at both of those spots. If you want to support us and the show, well, please write us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or again on our Facebook page at Bliss and Grit. There's also a new subscribe form on the website, again, blissandgrit.com, and you can sign up there if you want to stay in touch with all the goodies that we will have brewing for this community. We love hearing from you, both on social media, both your emails, and also in your reviews. It helps us know that we're doing a good job, but it also helps people find the show. So if you're not into technology, but you are enjoying the show, well, then just tell your friends who you think it might resonate with. Huge gratitude to all of you who have written reviews already. Here's one from Shaska K8. She says, I'm so grateful that my dear friend recommended this podcast to me. Through Brooke and Vanessa's wisdom, I have made big connections, had my mind blown, and found comfort and love. Each episode offers a new gem, and I can't wait to listen to them all. Oh, thank you so much for those beautiful words, Shashka K8. And thanks to all of you who've left reviews and to all of you for listening in. We'll be back next week.